Sorry for the audio blip. Thank you for joining us in Metatopia today. We're here to do Language Matters, flavorful versus clear language in your game. My name is Jonathan Lavallee. I'm going to be your moderator today. I've been making games for about 20 years, off and on, with line licenses with different companies. But you're here really for our panelists, and we'll let them introduce themselves. So, Misha, would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Misha B, she, her, she, they, actually. You can find me on Twitter as BG Gameworks or at my website, blackpearlgameworks.com. I'm a writer, sensitivity editor, and editor for board games, card games, RPGs, LARPs, all kinds of fun stuff. Yeah, let's go with the short version of that one.
And to you.
Hi, my name is Sen-Foong Lim. I use him pronouns, and I'm a game designer and developer from London, Ontario, Canada, the second best London in the world for like 138 years running now. Second best. Um, and yeah, so I usually am found designing and developing other people's games. And I work both in the board game, card game space and in RPGs. And yeah, I do some cultural consultation on the side when needed, but mostly design and then a lot of development of other people's games. So I take other people's games and make them even better. That's my job.
Awesome. All right, so let's go forward. Let's talk about defining what is a flavorful term, right? Because some people, it may seem pretty common, but common knowledge, but let's just try to make sure we're all working from the same thing. So, what does a flavorful term mean to you?
For me, a flavorful term is a term that usually is used to add to the immersion factor of a game. It often does, but sometimes it may fail. And that's kind of what we're here to talk about today. We talk about flavor text like at the bottom of magic cards. I think that was where flavor text became really, really prominent. It was at the bottom of these magic cards for Magic the Gathering, where it's just this little line of text that kind of draws you in, but doesn't give you too much and you don't have to read it because it's not game critical. But then we sort of started applying it to other aspects of game design, um, and sometimes it gets confusing. So, flavorful text to define it would be something that is a descriptive term that is not within the normal heuristic for language use. That's probably what I would say it is. What do you think,
All right.
Misha?
I would also, it's a way that you use a term that makes your game different than other games, either genre appropriate. For example, in Narun we used grace instead of dexterity. And it's not necessarily that it's different. It's grace is a word. People understand this word, but it's not necessarily the word that most people use when they're talking about dexterity because people are used to talking about dexterity. So sometimes it's just, okay, let's use a similar word that makes our game stand out. And so it's not quite the same versus, the same words that everybody else is using. Another one, a good example is GM versus DM versus
I
Game
just about to throw
Master.
it in there. Yeah.
Versus Master of Ceremonies or Mistress of Ceremonies. Which term do you use for the person who facilitates the game? And that's a great place that's full of examples of everybody's got a different idea. Some people just use the same initials, GM, but they mean something different. But everybody,
Game moderator.
yeah, game moderator, uh, NPC versus game master character, for example, or non-player character versus game master character versus background character, or what these all mean the same things. It's just each game has a different term for them, and those different terms are what most people consider flavorful.
Right. So, talking about the kind of GM kind of term, I think we should kind of go in this a little bit deeper. Beyond differentiation, right? Why might there be some reasons to try to create a more flavorful term for it, right? Beyond just, oh, Dungeons and Dragons has a dungeon master, generic term could be game master. How do we, yeah, let's just, let's go forward. There are beyond just differentiation. Why might you want to have a different term?
Well, I think the terms actually matter in that case because they set the tone for how we think about that role, which is slightly different than, calling dice cubes of chaos or something. They do the same thing. But in the, it's my favorite example. But from the GM, DM, storyteller. I've heard some other ones like archivist. All those really do have a different tone to them that get away from that antagonistic TPK kind of DMing to, hey, I'm co-creating the story with you, or hey, I'm the player's biggest fan, or hey, I'm doing this other role where I'm archiving your stories. I'm the one who's writing all the stuff down, but you, the players, are telling the story, and I'm not here to, wipe your entire party out. That might happen, but that's not my main role. Whereas I think a lot of, some of the older school things have a little bit of that more, not necessarily antagonistic, but can be. Whereas a lot of the more story based, narrative based games where you can actually give narrative control to the players, imagine that, have a softer feel to them. And I think that functionality is different and therefore may require or warrant a new term.
Mhm.
Yeah,
So
just to
Misha,
shift from dungeon master to game master. I mean, like, oh, I'm playing a game. We don't have any dungeons. Why would I call the person in charge of the game
Yeah, that's a
a
simple one, right?
dungeon master? Uh, so some of it is, yeah. What Sun was saying is it's a shift from what is this what is this role about, and defining it better for that game. Um,
well, I mean, also to bring that to Misha, another point is like it changes the immersion because we wanted to talk about immersion and so like what do you think is the right time to use the flavorful term and when do you need to say, okay, while this is a really good space for a flavorful term, when do we actually need to be clear because this is going to create confusion?
I think flavorful text has its place, uh, especially if it's explained well at the beginning. And making sure that the flavorful text you're choosing isn't so far out of the realm of normal that it's distracting. You had given an example when we were chatting earlier about using Aether for your discard pile, which okay, I can kind of see where that's coming from, but when I think Aether, I think more like magic than I think discard. So maybe that's not the best choice. Maybe for discard piles, I think garbage bin or trash pile or refuse or recycle or things that mean more than nebulous space that just exists out somewhere else.
Oh, you mean the
Which is
ether?
yeah, it's like why would I have a nebulous space that exists somewhere else in a card game where I'm trying to define a pile? A nebulous space is not a pile unless you're talking about my office, in which case yeah, that spells right. Um, but so yeah, picking words, and that's part of the editor role too. It's like, okay, I see you're using this term, but it doesn't really fit because the definition of that term really doesn't jibe with what you're using it for. And so sometimes that's where you gotta like rein it in a little. It's like, okay, I get that it's cool, but maybe let's go less cool and go, okay, discard means trash. Trash means discard. That I can understand. Aether. Why am I talking about a magic pile?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's definitely something about naming things that range from very concrete to more abstract. And the more abstract it is, the less I the less I want it to be, so in some ways, the less I want it to be this flavorful term. But oftentimes, if you're playing in a game, like, so because I work in board game space, and there's a lot of very, a long history of board games where cards are called cards, dice are called dice, and if you call them anything different, we're going to have problems with uptake, right? And the number one thing that stops people from playing games is reading rules. And if they have to then get like this chart to find out that, oh, cubes of chaos mean dice and plaques mean cards and your pawns are called this and all that other stuff, it's going to fall apart. There's no background knowledge. That's what we call it in educational psychology. And if they have the background knowledge of dice and cards and roll and move and discard, and all these other things that are very common within the hobby of gaming, that background knowledge can make reading fluency, game playing fluency increase because they know how to do those things already. They don't have to second guess themselves. I definitely have had games, not my own, but definitely games that I've read the rules of, and it's like you are going to, I don't know, escalate the situation, and they just meant play a card. And then they go to define escalating a situation means playing a card to the whatever. And I find in rules writing, and Misha, you might find this as well as an editor, that when you take, a whole paragraph or two to write out a definition of something, you probably have gone too far.
Yeah. If you can replace a paragraph with like a word, you've probably gone a little extreme.
Yeah.
Well, that goes back to another question I'm going to have is like, what about if, and it ties in a little bit to the GMDM kind of thing. We use all these different terms for it to try to set the tone, but because of that kind of historical knowledge, or so you had a different term for it, then, and it just skipped my mind. People will frequently say, "Oh yeah, that's the GM," right? And then just not even use the term, but refer to it as the GM. So I mean, just to bring that back out, is there still value then in creating these flavorful terms for things when people might use their previous knowledge to just override it with what their shorthand is?
I think so
Yeah.
still. Yeah.
I mean, just
But
because somebody is going to reduce it to something easy doesn't mean that it's not there. Uh, like there's like half a dozen words for stove versus range versus oven, but they're all still used, and
Yeah.
so it's not detracting from it. And what people are going to do at their table, you have no control over.
yeah.
So I guess to throw, Sen, I'm going to ask you a question to just
Yeah.
throw this out and say, where's that line then? Where do you think that line that you cry? I mean, I know you put one of them where if you have a paragraph to explain a very simple
Yeah.
action, you've gone over the line, down the alley, to the right, and visited the park. So
Yes.
like,
I think it's when it serves a purpose. So Misha's example before of grace equaling dexterity is a super good one, I think, because grace is similar to dexterity, but it's not the same as dexterity, depending on the setting of the world that you're playing and the characters that you're trying to play, the stories that you're trying to tell in that particular RPG. So, I mean, if you've ever made a PBTA game, you know that you have some stats, and those stats aren't necessarily what you think they are. Um, but so I play lots of masks. I like masks. And masks is really interesting because the stats aren't things like strength and
Mhm.
dexterity and constitution and wisdom. They are things like um, freak and danger, and they're actually really neat because they're your perception of yourself, right? And how you perceive yourself, how you think other people perceive you. And because they shifted it from, stats that I am this strong, I can lift this many pounds, to I feel dangerous today because I just hurt somebody. Now I feel more dangerous. And when I roll plus danger, now it's going to be even better or worse, depending on what you're doing. Um, that fit the idea. If you know anything about developmental psychology, and I do because that's what I teach, that is a perfect example of how teenagers, superpowered or not, think about themselves. They are a reflection of their friends, a reflection of the community that they're part of. And if somebody says something about them, they may take that on for themselves. Like, yeah, I guess I am that way. And masks did that beautifully by changing the stats from, very measurable things that don't change, like your strength really doesn't change much over the course of, a session. It really shouldn't. But your feelings about yourself can totally change, right? And I think when it has a purpose, when it has a meaning, that and it does something different. So my common things of cubes of chaos, they don't do anything different. It's still just rolling these dice that are cubes, and they're randomizers. They're still doing the same thing that a die does. So people are just going to call them dice. Whereas grace is probably technically different than dexterity. And, all the stats in Avatar Legends or all the stats in masks, they're definitely not analogous to things like strength, wisdom, constitution, dexterity, charisma, oh, comeliness, if you remember comeliness. They have nothing to do with those things, right? So I think when you have analogs that are just replacing another thing, people will
Mhm.
by nature, like Misha said, default to probably the word they use the most. But if there's a functional reason for them to be different, then that will probably have a better chance of sticking in the psychology of people.
Yeah, so Misha, where do you think that line is? I know that that's another. Is there anything else that kind of helps you define that line? Because when we were talking earlier, that's the line we're all trying to walk, right?
Yeah.
Making sure we walk the line where it's flavorful enough that it's great and immersive, but not so flavorful that it's clear, but not our language is so boring that everyone's like, wow, I have just read a text manual on the thing, even though that's what it is, right? But still, I think that's another panel.
I think Son made a good point. It is a difference between, is this making my what I'm writing stand out enough that it means something functionally different. So
Mhm.
like to go back to Mass as an example, they use potential as opposed to experience, and it really does have a different resonance, because it is, what am I living up to my potential? I am now taking that potential and I'm using it to gain more skills, as opposed to, experience. Yeah, experience feels like, okay, this is what I have done, and that's what's giving me this weight. So yes, they're analogous terms, but they do have a different connotation, and sometimes it's just in a matter of, yes, this word is different enough because that different connotation takes on a different weight and feeling to the whole thing, and that's when people choose to use that other word as opposed to, oh well, that's close enough.
Right.
Whereas, close enough in different, does it feel close enough or does it feel different, I guess, is a good way of looking at it.
And I think weight and feeling are two really good terms that you put in there that help kind of define that a little bit harder,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
Because you can see value in it, but again, like I'm guilty of that. I can see value in this because I'm in my headspace, but other people are not in my
Yeah.
headspace, and therefore they don't see the same thing I do. But if it has that weight and feeling and utility and difference, then that's kind of where we see that line kind of defining itself a little bit more. It's always going to be nebulous. We can't,
Yeah.
this. No, everyone, this is the absolute definition, hard and fast. You can't do this, right? But no, but it
Can't
helps
use the
Words
kind of.
word.
versus strings is
Yeah,
another good one. It's like, this is a bond we have with each other versus this is a string that I have tied around somebody else.
Right.
Little word just, and they mean functionally the same thing, but they
mhm.
really do feel very different in those choices.
Yeah, words do matter, right? And I think one of the terms I use a lot is, and I love Misha when you say like resonance. Resonance matters so much to me in game design, where it has to really resonate with the player. And the other word I use a lot is gravitas, thinking about the gravity of a situation that makes you want to play the game. And if words can help do that, then by all means use them, because sometimes, so I'll give you a little story about a game we made about graffiti. It's about graffiti. I think Jonathan, you might have played it. It's just about matching cards and overlapping them to make patterns of graffiti. And originally the game had like police, because graffiti artists and police often mix it up, and you're running away and stuff like that. But nobody who played the game thought they felt the pressure. It's like, it's just the police. They're just gonna slap us on the wrist. That's it, right? But then we said, okay, what if we put it in a world? In a world where you can't, because it was also about being quiet. The amount of noise you made while you're painting would alert the authorities, right? So what if it was a world where there were and wow, there was a movie that just came out about this. Holy cow. Aliens that could only hear you but couldn't see you. And so you had to paint really quietly. And the messages that you were painting were like how to rebel against these alien overlords. Anyways, so that changed the whole tone of the game. It changed the players' motivations. Now, just reading like a 5-line story about this stuff and then changing all the flavor of the cards to be slightly less about, just painting trains in New York to like, you need to survive this, alien invasion, and the way you're doing it is by communicating, drop locations by painting, because they don't know how to interpret art, these aliens, right? Because they're aliens. So that gave it that gravitas, that real like weight to the words, where they words now mattered. And so we were, therefore now we changed terms all over the place, because the original things of, like, mix a spray can and paint and things like that just weren't quite as, they didn't fit anymore.
Mm.
They didn't have that weight to them anymore. So now we changed those terms to other things. Like, I can't remember them off the top of my head, but they
Hmm.
just had a little more oomph to them because the story now had oomph. So I really like that resonant term that you use. I use it all the time. I think it's one of the things that I think about when I'm writing stories, writing games, and designing. It's like, will this resonate with the intended audience? And what am I using mechanically, thematically, in writing, in my fluff, in my mechanic writing, and all to convey that to people, that you need to understand this. And it's called Cubes of Chaos for a reason. I think my challenge to all of us is to use Cubes of Chaos in a game where it actually matters, and that people will call it that and not feel silly when they call them that. Hey, pass me the Cubes of Chaos.
Silly though. That's just it. Maybe the feeling silly is the point of using Cubes
Yeah.
of Chaos.
Yeah.
Even
And
if it was a
that's
silly
perfectly
game.
fine.
Right.
The other one is connotation, though, is
Mhm.
especially with English is so precise and imprecise at the same time.
Oh
So
yeah.
two words can technically mean the same thing, but have very different connotations. And so making sure you're using the one that you mean to. It's like, okay, I can use denizen, and that has a certain connotation versus resident. Whereas
Mhm.
technically they're the same thing, but they have very different
Different
images that
feel.
provoke in your head.
Mhm.
And so there are places where denizen is the one you want to use, where you want to have that grittier feel, whereas resident has that kind of a slightly lighter feel. And which one you choose really does matter. Like picking words with negative connotations is perfectly acceptable if you're trying to have a negative connotation, negative feel, and make it feel that way. Whereas if you're trying to make it a fluffier game, maybe denizen isn't the word you really want.
Right? No, that's really, really good. And I think there's other pitfalls with flavorful text talking about connotations and denotations, right? Where you may not understand a connotation may be sexist or racist or insensitive or offensive in some way, because you don't have that experience. Which goes back to why it's always important to make sure if you're going to be trying to do things that may have those things on it, you want to have sensitivity writer consultants and all that kind of stuff to get those perspectives that you don't have, because connotation is a very powerful, powerful tool. And if you are unaware of a connotation, it doesn't mean you didn't step in it.
Right.
Yeah. You might not mean
Right.
to step on my foot, but it still hurt when you stepped on my foot.
But you still did.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Still happened.
Right. So I have a question. I'm going to throw a couple of things, and then we'll see maybe if there's any questions right now. Do you have a personal story about using maybe a flavorful term when you probably should have pulled back? Or do you have something you're like, you know what, we really could have maybe pushed that further and have it been a more flavorful term? Something that you stand by, like ether. So,
You're still on that ether kick, man.
Ether is a perfectly lovely term, just not for a
it is.
Discord pile.
Just not for discard pile. Not for discard pile. Yeah.
I mean, so just to say, just to defend Jonathan and his ether fix, I can see it as it just went into the ether,
Yeah.
disappeared
Went
into the
into the
ether.
nothingness.
I can see where you would get that. I can
But
also see
yeah.
why Misha doesn't
Well,
like it,
Yeah.
because it's like most people wouldn't necessarily see that.
yeah, you may have noticed we have removed. If you ever play the game, we had removed it from the game. I lost that fight.
Oh, so personal stories. Got to think about this.
Right, because we just did mine. Mine is very much so that game is Hex Dex is the working title for it right now, and the idea is you're all conjuring magic and you're pulling in magic, but any magic that you don't gets discarded to the ether. Like that's why it was there, and it makes
See,
sense.
now it makes sense.
But again, it makes sense because I had to give you that explanation.
Yes.
Oh,
right? And it
here's
goes.
one.
Mhm.
Oh no, give us your explanation. Sorry,
Oh
Jonathan.
no, that was the thing. Is that again? It goes back to the idea is that that's in my head, but what is in my head is not in everyone else's head.
So I do have another rule that I use when I'm doing this kind of stuff. If the term that I want to use just replaces like a single action or thing, it's not good enough. Like it needs to be like a term that then refers to a bunch of stuff, right? So say in like WWE Rock Paper Wizards, Headlock Paper Scissors. I can't remember the title of the game.
Yeah.
Headlock Paper
You got too
Scissors.
many sin. That's why.
I know. So, we could have just wrote the text of what this person's ability did, but the WWE superstars, they have legit names for their moves, right? And even though, yes, it might just be a DDT held a different way, it's still classified as their finisher for if Roman Reigns and we didn't write spear next to their special move, we would get in trouble with all the fans, right? Because that's what it's called and that's what he calls it and that kind of thing. Now, another person who does essentially a spear but might call it like a three-point tackle because their gimmick is as a ex-jock football player, we'd have to call it that, right? So and Jonathan's smiling because we both love wrestling. So we know we like wrestling and that's what we're talking
Yeah.
about.
I grew up on
Uh
wrestling. We're fine.
yeah, pro wrestling. Um, but that's an example where we had to use the terminology um, that was given, and I would anyway because the move did a bunch of stuff. If it's just remove like take two, do two damage, I would just write do two damage. But because it has a whole bunch of things, like do two damage and move this and then do that, I need to call it something concise, like a specific move name, so that when people are asking questions about it, it's just I do this move, or hey, when my character does this move, what actually happens, right? I don't want them to say, hey, when I take two damage and do this and do this and do this, what actually happens? What's this? What are we referring to? So the usage of language also as a reference point, where you can then go search it up in something, where you can refer to it with to other players or to other people about that. I think that's really important to think about. And so if it's just a single action, I try not to replace that with a flavorful term. But if it's multiple actions that we can collect and put under one umbrella term, I will pick an umbrella term. And that umbrella term, to be immersive and fit the theme, usually is flavorful. There you go, Jonathan. That's another little rule of writing for me, anyway.
Misha's thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes a simpler term is just better.
Mhm.
Like if if I'm using a $10 word where a $2 word will work, sometimes the $2 word is better, especially if you're depending on who you're aiming the game at.
Okay.
For example, if I'm making a card game that's meant to be played with families, I don't want to be using a lot of big words because little kids don't know a lot of big words. And if you just start throwing them in there, unless you're my kid who uses vehicle instead of car for some God only knows reason, it's easier to using those simpler terms is better. Because then it's a little more accessible to everybody. So some of it is accessibility, but if you're making, in your example, you're making a game for a niche audience. You're making a game for WWE fans. They know these things. So you don't necessarily need to market that simpler, dumbed down version for everybody because you already have a market that you're defining for.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's just a matter of, okay, thinking about who am I writing this game for? And what do I want them to be able to understand without knowing a cajillion? Or am I writing this for people who do already know a cajillion things about this topic? Like if I'm making a game called Evil Princesses, okay, you gotta have that. I'm aiming it at like my kindergartner, and so okay, well, let's use simple terms that kindergartners understand. I don't need to throw in ether because if I tell my 5-year-old ether, they're gonna go, what's ether, mommy? And then I'm going to have to explain it.
You're gonna say, talk to Uncle Jonathan.
Yes,
You're gonna have to say.
go ask Uncle John.
This is like
He'll
the
tell you
anti-ether
everything.
coalition on this side, and then the ether coalition on
Yeah,
Jonathan.
If I'm writing a game about magic and about let's take the magicians or any of those top properties where ether is a term that they are using, then it is completely appropriate to use it there.
There you go. Here's a little tip for everybody out there. You might not know this app. It's called Hemingway app. It's a website actually. With one M, Hemingway app. And what it does, it'll analyze your writing and tell you like the grade level that you're writing it at, and it'll flag words for you that might be a little too, high brow, that you might want to tone down, so that the writing is more approachable and accessible, right? So that's hemingwayapp.com, I think. Yeah, so it's pretty cool that there's stuff out there to help you with your writing, right?
This was not a paid advertisement.
No, I mean, this is like I read a lot of books,
joking.
and so
I'm throwing in a
I
joke.
play a lot of Scrabble with my family who don't necessarily read the same books that I read. So they're like, "That's not a real word." I'm like, it's totally a real word, Dad. And so then they go look it up and challenge it. Yeah, hey, look, it is a real word.
Yeah, I guess the kind of the internet term for that would be how much Googling do I need to do for your game, right? Yeah. Define this word, define that word, right?
And maybe if you have words that you're using that are out of the norm, have a glossary. Have an easy place that I can flip to. Oh, that's what that word means, and flip back.
Here's an actual hint from psychology: is put that actually in the front. So it's interesting. Like most people, by logic, it's like, oh, that goes in the back. Who's going to use that? But the thing is that most people will. They do need that. And if you front load that learning before you're doing your fluent reading, like the reading that you have to do like all at once, so you have like little definitions, maybe in the margins, maybe a block at the front. These are important terms you need to know to read the rest of the document. People will pick up the rules much faster because the reading is easier. When you break up your reading into read and flip back and then flip back, oh, I've lost my point. Oh, I've read this 3 times. I still don't understand it. When you start with the background information first that they need to know to read the rest of the document fluently, the uptake is quicker. So there you go. A little more psych for you.
So I'm going to throw out maybe what's perhaps your most favorite flavorful term or thing you've ever put into a game, and give me the story behind it. How did that come to creation? Where do you decide to do it, and why? Like, not just this was really cool, I liked it, but here's the kind of thought process behind it. Throwing in curveballs, everybody. That's what I'm doing.
Right?
Yeah, you're making me think, and it's not past noon yet, John.
Yeah, it's like early. Favorite term.
Well, while they're thinking about that, I'm going to say, hey, Brendan, do we have any questions or anything you think might be interesting from people watching?
We do. We actually have one that is really close to what you guys were just talking about.
Sure.
Does PDF publishing create room for flavorful text when you can just mouse over and see a pop-up definition?
Yeah.
Ooh, flavorful text and technology. That's a really good kind of thing.
Yeah, I think it actually helps you be able to do that if the definition is right at the fingertips, literally at the fingertips of the person reading, right? So it definitely makes it more approachable. As long as people know those tooltips exist, then yeah, I'd say go for it without overwhelming people. Like, you don't want a screen full of tooltips that just pop up all the time. Like, if it looks like pop-up video, you might have gone too far.
Oh God, there's a blast from the past.
Right?
I was going to say that for those who are not of a certain age, music videos are things.
Oh, right, yeah. Man, did I just age all of us? I think I just aged all of us.
You just did. You just did.
Yeah, you did.
So like, what other technology tools do you think might be useful? Because I know there's a lot of push to, again, for accessibility, for making sure we have like audio versions of books and things like that. So how does a flavorful term then impact in something, say, like that? I mean, we didn't even talk about this. This is just me kind of throwing out there, like, other technology kind of ideas that we're moving forward towards. Where do you see that, or how do you see that kind of affecting flavorful terminology in your games?
I think with like audio text, it's even more important to be concise with your term choices, because that ability to like do a pop up or to flip around doesn't exist. When you're playing something, it's hard to just like, oh, yeah, how do I do that? So I think then it's better to just choose a term, or the first time you use a term, make sure fluidly in the sentence that you're using it, define what it means. So like if it, picking on ether again, if I'm saying like ether is a discard pile, where is the term we're going to be using for discard pile, where that is now removed from the game, for example, and then so it's there in the sentence fluidly, and now they have that information and they can just keep going. And that's a good tip for even when you're doing it in writing. Is like, the first time you're using a new term that you're going to be using as a game term, like bold it and have a definition, or at least an explanation of what it is right there.
Before we move on from bolding, please, 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 please refrain from using camel case as much as possible. Camel case, by the way, is when you write like every second word with like a capital letter, because it's an
Oh
important
yeah, God.
term. It's a key term. Reserve those types of things for very, very, very special things. So usually in rules, what we'll do is we'll like write the first instance of a keyword, we'll bold, indicating that this is a keyword, and there's probably a definition somewhere, which is like usually right next to it in the margin. And then we probably do marginalia, and we also do glossaries, and we also do other things like that. We want people to be able to find what they're looking for wherever they think it should be, right? So this is going a little more into like rule writing and layout, but this also does work for flavor, because flavor is something that if you want to add it, you can't just assume everybody understands where you're coming from, Jonathan, because they don't live in your head, Jonathan. So yeah, um, I would highly recommend thinking about how you're laying out your rules as well, because it will allow you to be more flavorful if you can do things that are readable. And so the problem with things like camel case is that if you have everything capitalized, it becomes really hard to parse as a reader. And if everything's important, nothing's important, which is the other thing. So use your capitalization and even your bold. Use that kind of stuff very judiciously, because how the human eye works when we scan reading, it will look for those things. It'll key in on those things. But if it's if it's just a wall of bolded text, then again, nothing is important. So.
No, that's great. I think it's
Yeah.
like it's all just different things. So Misha, you have something else you're gonna add, or?
That was pretty much it. And also, screen readers really hate when you do that capital lower thing. So
Totally hate that.
it sounds so weird. If you're ever curious, take your text and run it through a screen reader. See what it sounds like. If it sounds weird, then you probably should tweak that so it sounds a little more fluid and a little less. But that also helps you catch a lot of errors.
That's a great suggestion.
When you're reading something, your brain knows what it's supposed to be looking for, but when you're listening to something, your brain does it because you're not looking at the text, so it's not making that skip automatically.
Yeah. There's a lot to say about like having stuff read back to you in terms of all of this rules writing, flavorful text. Read it out loud, see how it trips off your tongue, or if it is fluid. When you're listening to it, listen to if there are little hiccups and little ways that your ear doesn't pick up on things and nuances that you might not notice when you're writing, because like Misha said, writing is a completely different, and reading is completely different than listening. So
Awesome. All right. So, Brendan, do we have any other questions?
We sure do. This question goes back to a little bit what you guys were talking about earlier. What do you make of the emergence of MC as a fairly sticky GM equivalent term in PBTA games? Any lessons or implications there?
It works for me.
Yeah.
I think it just shows to the growth of people who have started playing games that are not out of D&D. Again, I'm not here to say whether D&D is good or bad. I'm not here to say that. But when you say a term is the sticky term, it's because it is in use, right? If everyone is using this term, then it means it's the term that's popular and the term that's currently in use. So if more people are using MC as one, I think for me, all it's doing is just showing a increase in the widely availability and the fact that people are playing them more and more first rather than coming in as D&D. It's interesting. It's just, again, it goes back to, I think, our original point when we talked about how, hey, these are all great and everyone will, it's a great place to have that flavorful term to help kind of drive how you want it. Because if you look at, say, what Sen said with archivist, right, as a term, it's not master of ceremonies, right? It's a very different connotation and it puts it in a different mindset in a different direction. So it's still plenty of space for other stuff. It's just an interesting kind of, I think, shift in the kind of general knowledge base of players on the whole.
There's even different mechanics being an archivist versus being a master of ceremony. If you look at games that use different titles, you're doing different things as that role. I can tell you right now, just based on Avatar Legends, there are going to be a lot of people who don't encounter DM as their first term, because we had a whole lot of people who are first time, not only first time backers, but first time RPG players get Avatar Legends. So when it comes out, they will not have seen DM or GM as a term. So they will first encounter likely MC. I can't remember what we actually call it because it doesn't bother me what we call it in that particular game. So it'd be interesting. I should go look and see what do we call it. I didn't write that part, so I don't know.
Yeah, we call it Garud. We do use Game Master just because I think, and I remember having the discussion about it at the time. It's like, okay, do we want to use a different word entirely? Do we want to, or do we just want to? It's like, and sometimes path of least resistance is the reason you might choose like a GM or an MC term, because everybody who you're targeting in your audience already knows what that word means, and so if it's not broke, why fix it?
I'm gonna say it's gonna be GM because it's a Magpie product and Brandon is the lead writer, so I'm gonna say it's gonna be GM because he used GM for masks. Well, that's the other thing. So if you are making a PBTA game, everybody knows like moves. We call things moves. They're not feats. They're not powers. They're not abilities. They're moves. And because of the language that you use in specific game systems, now you know if you've GM'd a PBTA game before, oh, this is how moves are used. This is the standardization through language of usage, right? So of uses of mechanics. So I know that I wait for the narrative to happen, and then I say, oh, it sounds like you're doing this move, which is definitely a different way of playing from people who are traditionally, OSR style gamers. But I like it better. So there you go. That's why I enjoy writing for PBTA games and why I like things like We Used to Be Friends, Jonathan. See, I always bring it around. Bring it around.
Bring it back. Bring it back. Okay.
Not
so
either. I don't like either.
That's perfectly fine. Perfectly fine. So I guess we've talked about it sideways on the side a little bit, but let's talk about immersion, right? And how does a flavorful term help with immersion, right? Like what in particular does it do for immersion? When used, again, say following a lot of the things that we talked about, where we know it's going to be, it's not replacing, it doesn't require a paragraph to explain what it does. It's not replacing a simple action. It's actually kind of, we feel it fits and it helps clarify. What other benefits are there from using flavorful terminology?
I think go ahead, Misha.
I'm playing futuristic game, right? But I'm using terms that are usually used in like high fantasy worlds. That's not going to make me think futuristic. So that's a place where I want to use, okay, this is where I want to use those future. I want to talk about mechs. I want to talk about robo this, and I want to talk about nano that. But if I'm taking those same terms and I'm putting that in a high fantasy world, and now I'm talking about mecha something, and I'm like, these are two very different situations, and they feel very different. So it's again back to the what feel am I trying to evoke with the words I'm choosing.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm trying to evoke a futuristic setting, I don't want to use archaic words. If I'm trying to evoke a more archaic setting, I don't want to use futuristic words. So placing in time and placing in space, like let's take Dune. It's a top of mind example. And Herbert used a lot of Arabic words for concepts within the Dune universe. And that automatically put your brain into a space where you were thinking about a desert world and a desert planet and this sort of thing. So by just choosing, rather than using the English equivalent, he's using a different word, it automatically evokes that feeling. And so, yeah, using those things, it's an instant shortcut to put you in that headspace that you want to be in to play that game.
Right. But again, the issue coming up with talked before, the one of the criticisms of Dune is that by doing this, he's also recreated stereotypes and yeah,
White
right.
dude in the like 50s and 60s trying to encourage Arab oppression without ever having experienced Arab oppression. That's a totally different kettle of fish.
Different topic.
That's
It's true, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
true, right? You know, what's
But
that line from Ted Lasso? Oh, you found out your dad's racist. He's a 60-year-old man from South London. Of course he's racist. I'm aware of
Yeah.
this.
Pretty much.
yeah, it's an interesting thing because if you ever listen to Daniel Kwan or anybody on Asians Represent and things like that, we'll always talk about the misuse of the word honor in any role playing game that involves Asia. For some reason, y'all think we're all about honor, and we're really not. A better term would be face. If you want to be really technically correct, it's about face. Or duty might even be okay, but it's not honor. And it's not, well, it could be honor, but it's not necessarily honor, and almost definitely not the Western sense of honor. Um, and so language does matter, right? Context matters. All those things that Misha has been talking about totally matter. And we need to be very, very sure that when we use language that is trying to immerse in a world, that we understand that world. So another term, this is a watch word to think about, is what's the difference between the use of slave and enslaved people? There's a major connotative difference, right? So we have to think about that when we're trying to use thematic words or thematic elements at all.
Yeah, no, it's really important to have, again, going back to the idea of that, if you aren't paying attention, what are you going to step in? Because
Right.
you're not paying attention to the connotation of the flavorful language that you're trying to use,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, so we're got a couple minutes left. Brendan, do we have any other questions?
You have plenty.
Oh,
You
yeah.
guys are very good at talking about things that are really close to questions, so we're going to continue that path. Are there
Yeah,
ways?
we're on trend.
Are there ways to balance flavorful text so new players can painlessly grasp how to play, but more experienced players can embrace the world building?
Yes. It goes back to knowing your audience and explaining things as you go along. So, it's yes, if you want to use a flavorful word, make sure you explain what that flavorful word means in context of your game.
And so you can do that diegetically, where it's actually in the world that you're explaining the world
Mhm.
term, or you can do that very expositorily, where you are like as a watcher, like Owatu in What If, talking about that thing from a very rules perspective, third person writing, whatever, as opposed to in the world writing, and both work. It just depends on how much how good of a writer you are in some ways to put it in diegetically. To put it in just like carte blanche, this is what it means. That's simple. It just may not be the most artful way, but it is the most direct way.
Yeah.
Pros and cons.
Right? Misha, you have a thought on that one, or?
play examples are great when you actually write out a play example, and use the terms that you're trying to define. Like, if I'm talking about discarding to the ether, I want to put that in a play example so that they understand what that means.
That's great. That's really, really good. We build scripts when we are learning things. Like, that's how we learn how to do things. In a lot of ways, we build a script, and if we use the language as we're building scripts, so we talk through it, it's really, really important. In board gaming, we often talk about narrating our turn, which we do almost automatically in role-playing games, right? And so that whole idea of narrating a turn example in the rule book is really important to let new players know how they should act and behave and what they should say or could say. And again, I'm going to hold up Mask just because it's right next to my desk. Mask has some great examples of that from both the player and the GM side. Oftentimes, there isn't much from either side, but they did a really great job in Masks of catching both sides of the equation, which made it actually much easier for me to pick it up. Even somebody who's played like lots and lots of PBTA games, when I picked up Masks, I really appreciated that because there were some differences, because Masks is slightly different because all PBTAs are slightly different than each other, right? So the examples help to illustrate what those differences are, and the language, the definite change in language was exemplified in those. So it was great.
Yeah. Especially with card games and newer board and card games with some of the newer technologies, if you can film and put on YouTube like a couple examples of this is how you set up the thing, so that there's a visible example so that people can see. It's like, oh, that's what you're saying when you say do this to this thing. Like, I know what tap mana means because I played Magic for forever, but if I tell my kid, hey, go tap mana, they're going to just look at me. What does that mean? But hey, I have a video here that you can explain. This is what this means when somebody says this. And with TikToks and Tumblrs and YouTubes, and there's plenty of options for putting that out there such that it's accessible for everybody.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, I mean, I was going to say, like, if you're talking about narrating your turns, like, I play a lot of Commander for Magic, and so I watch a lot of the Commander stuff, and they're always like, this is the step, now I do this. This is the step, now I do this, right? So it's interesting to have that kind of scene happening in any type of, like you said, and it happens naturally in an RPG, but we're seeing it happen, kind of that crossover into board games and collectible card games as well, where people are narrating their turn, providing that script.
Well, for sure in Magic, it has to happen because I can't read your tiny font cards from my side of the table. So you got to tell me what you're doing.
I need the glasses so I can see what that even says.
The reminder text now, which is the whole text of the card, it just has the keyword and then the reminder text.
I mean, literally, just watch Yu-Gi-Oh, right? Like, haha, you fell into my trap card, right? They're narrating their turns.
Yeah. Okay, Brendan. Any other questions?
Yep. Is HP entrenched enough as a term that we should all embrace it, or is the profusion of alternate names and tweaked systems like stress, conditions, darkness, etc. a development justified by flavor?
Conditions are very different from hit points.
Yeah, and that was a very well-written question.
Yeah, it was.
Somebody put some thought into that.
But yeah, to me, those things do mean very different things. Like hit points, unless they're so there's a lot of different ways that just do damage systems in general. There's a lot of different ways that things work. Systems that use just flat hit points, where it's like, okay, it doesn't matter whether I got thwacked in the head or I got thwacked in the arm or I got thwacked in the leg. We're just going to reduce my hit points by this much, and when I fall below this, I'm dead or severely injured or whatever.
Yeah.
That's like one set. Then there's you've got your PBTA style conditions where it's like, all right, I feel this way, so I'm going to be a little worse at these moves until I clear up this condition. That's another set. And then you've got some of your more targeted, if I take X amount of damage to this body part, then this body part doesn't work kind of things, which is somewhere in between those two things. And those are different enough that they warrant different terminology and different ways of talking about them. So I don't like hit points as in general, just because it doesn't make sense that I can get thwacked in the leg for all day and my leg doesn't hurt, but I'm going to die from getting kicked in the leg 400 times. That's not generally how it works. And that
My
drives me a
shins
little
might
bonkers.
really hurt, but
Yeah, but I'm not generally going to die. So that's just a personal quirk of mine.
yeah, I think definitely they do because they mean different things. Like so stress is very different than health, is very different than what other damage tracking that you're doing, if you're doing any at all. Um, and that goes to what stories do you want to tell? You know, do you want there to be death? Do you want there to be loss? Do you want there to be, is this a game that is talking about the mental anguish that people feel when they are incarcerated? So I made a game about that pretty much, but it wasn't, prisoners. It was like children put in cages at the border. I don't know if you've played that, Jonathan. That was a weird one. But we didn't track health. We tracked memories, right? Because that's actually what happens to a lot of the kids who are incarcerated. They lose their contact with their family. They lose their memories. All of their memories of happy childhood are replaced with like awful memories of being in a cage in a like equivalent of a concentration camp. So that's what we tracked, and it matters that it wasn't hit points because hit points would not have again had that gravitas, would not have that resonance, would not have that moment of oh my gosh, that's what's happening. I'm not dying, but I'm losing bits of myself that are possibly more important than health, right? So there's a lot of stuff in there in that question that I think yes, it does warrant it, depending on what those things are doing. If you're using hit points just like all other hit points are used in all other systems that use hit points, perhaps just call them hit points because that way people will understand what you're doing. But if you're doing something markedly different with it, or if it's supposed to represent something markedly different than just like I'm alive or I'm dead, uh, then yeah, I mean a different word is totally plausible.
Awesome. Well, since we're at the 2-minute warning, where can we find everyone's stuff? Sen, where can we find your stuff?
Oh, you can find my stuff on well, I'm on Twitter at Sen-Foong Lim, SenFoongLim, and my game with Banana Chan called An Exquisite Crime, which is a GM-less drawing game of surreal crimes that are solved by psychic detectives, is currently on Kickstarter. We're on day 2 or 3, I think. We're almost funded. So, it wasn't Avatar Legends. But it's still a really cool game. In fact, it's one of my favorite games that we've ever made because it's just really interesting. You play by making exquisite corpses, and if you know what that is, then you understand. But if you don't know what that is, go look it up. You can actually see Banana make one on her Twitter or my Twitter or her Instagram or TikTok if you follow her. So yeah, go check there.
To be,
Okay, Misha,
you can
yeah,
find
you.
me on Twitter as BGGameworks or my website blackrowgameworks.com. You can also find a curation of stuff that I work on with a couple other people where we collect games by gender marginalized designers. It's called More Seats at the Table. It's a bi-weekly newsletter, and you can sign up for that and get it free to your mailbox where we highlight things like Monstrous Consumption, which is another game by Banana Chan.
Yeah.
It's on Kickstarter and amazingly cool and stuff like that. And Jonathan, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, so you can find me pretty much everywhere as Firestorm Inc. on Twitter, itch, DriveThruRPG, the website firestorm-inc.com. My recent game that I'm trying to finish up, the final version of We Used to Be Friends, which is my teenage detective powered by the apocalypse collaborative game. So there's no GM. You just kind of build the mysteries you build together. So thank you everyone for attending. Greatly appreciated the questions. Lovely conversation. Thanks, Misha. Thanks, Sen. And we will see you all. Hopefully you enjoy the rest of the convention.